So it looks like we're all here. Good evening or good morning, depending on where we're all coming from. Thank you everyone for joining us for this final session of a fantastic 2 days of conversation around environmental law and the extinction problems that it raises. We're really excited to have our final session extending the conversation that we began this morning with lots of interesting interpretations of new directions that environmental law can take and to really challenge the foundations of environmental law and the way it engages with extinction problems. And we're really going to up the ante on that discussion. We've got two really fantastic speakers and some big names to finish this workshop with. So we'll be starting off with Glenn Albrecht and then moving on to a joint paper from Afshin Akhtar-Khavari and Katie Woolaston. But it's going to be Afshin leading the conversation today. So to kick us off, I'm very thrilled to introduce Glenn. Let me just scroll over to the right document. Glenn is going to present his paper on Ghehds, which is a new term. And Glenn, if anybody has read anything about Glenn and his work, he's known for coining terms. We were just discussing some of his previous work in that field. So Glenn is a former Professor of Sustainability at University in Western Australia and is an Honorary Fellow of the School of Geosciences at Sydney University. He is an environmental philosopher with both theoretical and applied interests in the relationship between ecosystem and human health. And this is the coining of terms. He's pioneered the research domain of the psychoterratic or earth-related mental health conditions with the concept of solastalgia, or the lived experience of negative environmental change. Glenn's book, Earth Emotions, New Words for a New World, was published in 2019 and has already been translated into French and Spanish. And he has led several grant projects examining the impact of environmental change on regional communities in Australia. So, Glenn, I invite you to lead off this evening.
Thank you very much, Erin, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all in this workshop, and I extend my thanks to Afshin and all the others who have done amazing work to make it happen. I also acknowledge my occupation of the Warramai and Wonnarua land on which I live. I also live near what the Europeans call the Paterson River, and they renamed it because it was formerly called the Yimeng by the Indigenous people of this area. So tonight I'm going to talk about something which has a title that some people would not even recognise at least two of the words in it. And it's a deliberate attempt to try and disrupt the concept of rights. And I hope that my presentation will be taken in the vein of, I think rights are doing too much in our current ethical and legal environment. And I want to take the pressure off them. And I might sound as if I'm pushing in a really extreme position in this paper, but I'm always willing to accept that that rights have got a long way to go, and that my nudging them is hopefully seen as something constructive. And so the title is The Extinction of Rights and the Extantion of Ghehds. Well, extansion is a word that most people would not have heard of. And so I'm going to define that in a second. But in the light of my previous comment, I'd like to say that Einstein might have once said that you can't solve the problems of the Anthropocene by using the same anthropocentric thinking that created those problems in the first place. He did say something like that, but obviously not exactly that. So I'm going to argue that in addition to scientific advances in the way we understand our world, we also need to have cultural, ethical, and legal change, and that we're at a position in our history where this change process is becoming critical. So the words extantion, in English we know what extant means, which is that it still exists. So I just simply added a little bit extra to it. So extansion is an action that values the existence of life. And I was thinking that we have extinction rebellion, but we don't have extansion celebration. And yet the things that are still with us are actually incredibly important and worthy of our our close attention. So that's another issue that I thought a word can begin to shock and move us in the way that we're thinking. And Ghehds. Now, Ghehds is ancient. It's one of the oldest words in the Indo-European languages. It means to unite, but we've used it to create words in English, such as together, to gather, and the word good. And I was looking for a concept that might help me improve on the concept of rights. And up popped this word, ancient word, which the idea of a word for good that we've no longer have in use was just too irresistible. So all I did was put an S on the end so that it looked and sounded a bit like rights. And rights also have a GH in them. So I thought it can't be too much of a shock to create, with a tiny little change, a new word that actually looks a bit like rights. So the paper that I've written is in a number, it goes through a number of arguments, and they're in detail. And I try and put the concept of rights as we have come to understand it in a historical, almost cultural context. And, it's a word that didn't exist in modern languages until the late Middle Ages. So we obviously can't go back to the ancient Greeks, or there aren't other cultural contexts where we can find the word right and the practices and institutions associated with it in existence, because it just simply wasn't there. So that makes you think that it was a concept invented by somebody, a bit like myself, who was thinking, well, we need a new term to describe a new context that is not being adequately dealt with by our existing conceptual framework. So the way that we can do this is go back to older cultures, traditional cultures, and have a look at issues that are related to rights. And I call them proto-rights only in the sense that they're the original attempts to describe something like the right thing to do, right reason, the good, the fair thing to do. They're all connected to the primordial or first uses of the word right. And it's the conversion from the idea of the right thing to do or right reason into a thing called rights that becomes the formal application of the concept of rights. And of course, some of the early scholars, philosophers that worked on the concept of rights did so in a way that negated the idea of rights-like concepts operating in other cultures. And I'll get onto this in a minute, but it's quite clear to me that humans are social animals, and they've always had within their cultures, within their rules, within their cultures, ways of trying to sort out the distribution of benefits and burdens, particularly in times of scarcity. And even in Australia, the land of terra nullius, according to the early colonists, we find that there's quite clear support for the idea that Aboriginal Australians had clearly defined proprietary rights. They had them well worked out for themselves and with other tribal groups in their geographic area. And that these are very similar to the kind of rights that were operating in England at the time the colonists were leaving. We also have the context of the ancient Greece, where I'm really interested in the origins of words. So the concept of oikos, oikos in the Greek society, ancient Greece, was the household, and the management of the household was what the role of the male, the dominant male, if I could call it that, in the Greek household was to do. So they had rights, in a sense, to property and to participate in government. Voting was one of their rights. But of course, women, slaves, and people of colour were excluded from participation in the public and political domain in ancient Greece. So the word oikos, most people know, was coined by Ernest Haeckel in 1866, And it was derived from, the word ecology is derived from the same root as the word economy. And so this definition refers to the management of the household. And Donald Worcester goes on to say, before the advent of modern political economy, men assumed that national economic affairs could be conceived of as merely extensions of the household keeper's budget and larder. And I'll argue later that we actually haven't moved far from that idea of the OIKOS, because we've applied it directly to environmental management and the way that we are conceiving of the way the human hyphen nature relationship works. So, you know, there's a long story here, and there are philosophers and scholars of jurisprudence who have looked at rights in detail. But most people would argue that it was John Locke around 1690 who took the context of proto-rights into the new context of individual humans. So it left a communitarian context and became something that individuals do by virtue of the work that they perform on nature, and that the property that they create then becomes their becomes privately owned. So the further shift is that formal rights can only exist when granted and protected by formal government. So that, you know, it was like, it was Bentham who argued that there are no such thing as natural rights. You actually have to have governments formalise them and promote them and make sure that they have some kind of credence. But it was also Bentham that argued that, and the quote, savages, is from his own work, that savages lack government rules and hence they couldn't possibly have rights. And so Bentham's view of rights as intimately connected to government allowed colonists to come to Australia and see that the continent was an empty land or a terra nullius. So that history is important to know something about.
I'm just going to interrupt you and say you've got 5 minutes to go.
Yep. The philosopher in me says that we've gone from there into a moral context where we now talk about the social invention of the autonomous moral agent. So that's a person that has rights, and they're contesting these rights within a public context where the clash between individual rights becomes a quite serious basis for conflict in present society. And we can see that unfolding in many aspects of you know, the current incident or the issues about vaccination for COVID. Even the clash between nation states about access to vaccinations is really quite critical. And the connection between rights and capitalism, well, I can't do much better than Ayn Rand, who says if you want to uphold individual rights, you must realise that capitalism is the only system that can do this for you. So there's no doubt that rights and capitalism have gone hand in glove. So the extension of rights to the environment, we've had papers on that, so I don't need to go through that in detail, but the case studies that I look at suggest that the extension of rights to the environment has been one of failure rather than one of success. So that's obviously a controversial statement, but I would back it up with a further analysis of the issues of the Wanganui River and various other places where, you know, if water itself is, there's no right to it, then I can't see the point. So the other issue is that environmental management itself, once we start getting enmeshed within capitalism, the idea that there are identifiable parts of nature, getting back to the OIKOS, means that we're now starting to conceptualize individual parts of ecosystems as offsets, as enclosable, as assets, as biobanks, as natural capital or stock in the shop of life. And this is leading us down a path which inevitably suggests to me that the dominant, most powerful holders of corporate rights will be the ones that will win out in that end game. So to shift to Gheds and the context that I'm trying to argue for now is that we've seen a revolution in the way we understand life, particularly in the last 50 years, highlighted in plant-fungi relationships, but now the big new areas, the human gut microbiome. We discover that we're not who we thought we were. We're hollow bions, where we consist of multiple organisms, multiple species all living together. We've got trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi all working with us to stay alive. So this idea that we are autonomous individuals has been knocked down by science with a capital S. And so as a result, this radical new scientific understanding of what we are as individuals needs to be replaced with a new form of thinking. So to be symbiocentric, the symbios is actually the root word for symbiosis. In Greek, it means to live together or living together. So to get out of anthropocentric thinking, human-centered, we need to come up with something which is more reflective of the way not only the rest of the world is, but the way humans are themselves. So I've created the concept of the Symbiocene, where the next era in our existence will be based around the protection, the appreciation, and the ongoing conservation of symbiotic processes within all natural systems at all scales. And that to return ourselves, our bodies, our psyches, our culture with the rest of life is a noble and good achievement. So Ghehds then replaced the concept of rights in this new context. The old context was individuals contesting with each other as atoms, as isolated egos. Ghehds become, instead of a hierarchy of competing rights, become entitlements of vigility, passage, movement, and flow within organically and symbiotically unified wholes. Rights assume division and exclusion. Ghehds assume unity and inclusion. So I don't have time to go through this, but if we begin to apply that idea at micro to macro scale, we can begin to imagine that a whole set of principles and ethical ideas will emerge from the shift in thinking from atomism back, in a sense, to a more communitarian way of thinking. But the community is not just the external community, it's also the community of life that we understand within ourselves. And I see that as having some parallel with the idea of Australian Aboriginal songlines. How to do the right thing becomes something that you read from the environment and that you appreciate. So my conclusions are that we need to get rid of the concept of rights. It's had a 300-year success story. It's now falling to bits and it's time for it to go. That's also true for concepts like the environment. It's outside of us. Wrong. It's got to go. Ecological. It's contaminated by the Greeks. Sorry, Greeks. Regenerate. Well, you can regenerate all sorts of nasty things. Sustainability has never been defined. So rights now falls into a category mistake along with all of these redundant concepts. And they become redundant because our intellectual traditions have now moved on to a new context. We're seeing a number of extinction cascades, and the work that I do is to look at the extinction of our emotions. I've even had to create a new concept called MEUACIDE from another Indo-European root word, MEU, which means to remove, or motion, or emotion, are all connected to that term. So I'm rebelling against the extinction of our good earthly emotions. So to champion Ghehds is part of this whole process of creating a more optimistic, hopeful future that Jonathan Lear called radical hope. He said it's a hope that is directed at a future goodness that transcends the current ability to understand what it is. Well, I think I'm beginning to understand what it is without being too arrogant about it. So I welcome you all to the Symbiocene, because I think that's where radical hope lies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I think that was a fantastic, mind-broadening presentation, particularly on a Friday night, to really get us out of the groove, out of the established modes of thinking, and to challenge the very foundations of the words we use, as well as the way we think. Does anybody have a question for Glenn? Glenn, I might get you to stop sharing your screen, just so
right.
that I can see everybody.
I'll do that now.
Fantastic.
And make it. Is that better?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul.
Thanks, Erin. Glenn, thank you for the presentation. I've read your work extensively, not just your publications, but also your work with nostalgia in the Bulger decision from some years ago. I want to take it back, though, to one of the early things you said in your presentation, and then that thread that sort of carried through. Some scholars, I think Clive Hamilton in particular, said that, unlike, you know, your sort of use of the Einstein quote, that the way out of Anthropocene is, ironically and paradoxically, more anthropocentrism. Mm. So I'm just interested to know how you would respond to that particular view.
Well, I think the challenge to the Anthropocene comes through, you know, again, I need more time to elaborate this, but the symbios, the living together, is such a radical change to the foundations of the way humans, all humans, can now address their relationship to life. I mean, so I'm focusing on the common thread is life. It's life that we share. Species and ecosystems are abstractions that humans can use at their convenience to describe agglomerations or conglomerations of life. The idea of the Anthropocene, I mean, I find the term, and always have found it somewhat offensive. But when I first heard the term, I sort of said it to myself and almost threw up. It was like, how on earth can humans really reach the stage where, even if there's no scientific agreement, that we are now the dominant mover and shaker on the planet, and this is how it ought to be. I know that there is a good Anthropocene and that people have argued that we can sort our way out of this, but I think my effort is to try and get us to appreciate that it's only by uniting with the rest of life to see our human creativity and the sapien in Homo sapien as reuniting with the intelligence that is within the rest of life, that we're actually going to get out of the problems that we're in now. So I just disagree with Clive and others that think that more anthropocentric thinking will get us out of the problem of the Anthropocene. So I'm trying to shake that idea to its core. And obviously I'm not the only one. There are many others that have attempted to do the same. But I'm just, you know, I'm stuck in my particular groove, so I'll just stay there until, you know, I'm shaken out of it, or maybe it actually has something to offer. I don't know.
Michelle.
Really like the way in which you are using a reframing of language to push back against particular ways of thinking. And in many ways, it reminds me of work of Indigenous scholars, where as part of the decolonization process, they're changing the way in which words have been used. And then I was then thinking about how the words you've chosen often have a Greek origin, or the ones that you were talking about today had a Greek origin, or yep, perhaps an Old English Indo-European origin.
Yep. And
given that culture, ontologies, etc., are so embodied in language, where one language often can't explain a thing or a sense of being in another language. I was wondering if you've had collaborations with Indigenous groups, and how perhaps drawing through First Nations languages might be a way in which to provide a lens to think about that reconnection or different connection with land, with country, that we might need against that Anthropocene type concept.
Look, I agree entirely. I think the process, needs to the deconstruction of terms, like even the concept of sovereignty, implies enclosure and boundaries. Well, all sorts of people use the term sovereignty now, including Indigenous scholars, that I find objectionable, but they don't. So I find it difficult at times to figure out what to do. But, I'm familiar with many terms in Indigenous languages, but my beef has been mainly with the English language and its inability to describe, for example, the gap that solastalgia fills is one that Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous artists, have communicated with me extensively over the last few years in particular. And they want to run exhibitions around the theme of solastalgia because they think it describes something what their language can't describe. And there's another point, I guess, which is that the subtitle of my book is New Words for a New World. We're all in a difficult situation now because the Anthropocene has now changed the world to such an extent that there are not many languages, and certainly not the English language, that has within it a framework to enable us to comprehend the changes that we've enacted on ourselves. So the language is impoverished, it's just not there. And other cultures have the same issue, like the Inuit with their disintegration of their ice world, the cryosphere. I had to borrow a term from their cultural context and put it into an environmental one. So the word is, Ugianatuk, and it meant a friend who's acting strangely, but it referred in the past to, like your best friend that wants to punch you in the hotel. They were once predictable and reliable, and now they've become unfriendly and unreliable. So that's now the climate. The climate's become Ugianatuk. So if they have trouble figuring out how their language can cope with the novelty of the changes that we've imposed on ourselves, the globalization of development, the global nature of global warming, these are things that no culture has got a lived experience of, and their languages are not. It would be too much to ask for their languages to have an explanation of what's going on. So that's part of my reason for wanting to create new words. I don't want to say anything on behalf of Indigenous people, and particularly Australian Aboriginal people, but I'm hoping that if they feel the same way about our inability to describe this novel world that we ourselves are responsible for, not all of us equally, then this act of word creation, finding new ways to describe something which was previously indescribable, or was a feeling that we all had, but it didn't come to the surface. It's like a Wittgensteinian problem, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Okay, well, let's create some new language and expand our world. There's nothing to stop me now. I'm not in the university anymore, so I'm not going to be cut off from the research grant because I've created something that people don't like. It just doesn't worry me.
On that note, I'm going to take one more question and then we'll move on to Afshin's presentation. So Marie.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy with your invitation to welcome us in the Symbiocene. I very much accept this invitation gladly.
Oh, I feel lonely sometimes, so thank you.
But I think you're making a very important point about how we conceive of our being, or how we see life unfolding and being sustained on Earth, let's say, through symbiosis. So I appreciate the switch from autopoiesis to symbiosis, and I think I very much align your work here with the one from Donna Haraway on her invitation to think and act symbiotically. And I think, again, it's a very important ontological intervention, but I always struggle to translate that into legal discourse. So I think inventing this new word is very important in its performative effect on how we conceive of life on Earth, but how to translate this epistemologically into a legal form is something I very much struggle with, because law is, in essence, I mean, if you translate a symbiotic way of thinking into any legal discourse, legal norms, or legal practice, we're going to be into something where it's delimited, it's bounded, it's predetermined. And I think the productiveness of thinking symbiotically is about radical openness, is about permanent unfolding, is about collective making. So there is basically no boundaries left in symbiotic way of thinking and acting, while any legal form, let's say, is something where there is a predetermined way of thinking and acting. And I think this is something that maybe indeed we have to accept, that it's only an ontological intervention that is not translatable into legal norms or practices. I wonder if you can help me think through this.
Well, in my book Earth Emotions, I acknowledge Donna Haraway's concept of symbiosis and completely accept the implications that follow from thinking that way. And so I'm at one with her on that. I think there are some practical outcomes. The idea that instead of protecting species and individual members of species, or even ecosystems, that we begin to think about, well, it's the process of symbiosis that connects all of these things up, and yet we don't include symbiosis as a consideration in any type of impact assessment. It wasn't, you know, you don't find it in the principles of sustainability. You don't find it in any kind of formal impact assessment documents. You don't even find, for example, you know, the fact that there's a deep earth microbiome, but we frack. We don't even assess the impact that we're having on yet another world of interconnection. And so the mere fact that we're beginning to focus on that which is joining, uniting and connecting has practical outcomes for the way that we do our assessments. So there's a, you know, that I don't know how, you know, I'm a transdisciplinary feral philosopher, so it's difficult for me to think about how to translate those ideas into the law, but they are practical. Protecting flow, fragility, the passage idea is also something that has practical outcomes. We have one analogous right, which is the right of passage that ships have. Yet there are, as far as I know, there aren't any others. So it's not impossible for us to rehabilitate rights to begin to think about more of the sort of things that we'll do for ships, but we won't do it for the Great Barrier Reef or the Amazon. So I don't see it as that hard. It's mind turning because we haven't had to think about it in the past, but now we do. And I think the science of symbiosis and the implications that flow from that are so rock solid as a knowledge base that they can no longer be ignored. They used to be dismissed as, you know, the flights of fancy of Lynn Margulis and a few individuals, but it's moved rapidly from that. I mean, there's even now capitalism's interested in the microbiome, so you know it's got to be true. So that's how important this change has now become. So I hope that answers your question, but I guess my point with the paper is to stimulate the people with the appropriate expertise and knowledge to actually do that work. I can't do it, nor do I want to.
Fantastic. Thank you, Glenn, for those insights and for that really wonderful opening presentation. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to move on to the paper by Ashton and Katie. So this paper is titled The Nature of Legal Decision Making About Extinction. And I've been informed that Afshin is going to speak to it alone and has only recently completed preparing the presentation. So Katie has washed her hands of it. So to introduce, Afshin really needs no introduction. He's one of the team that brought us all here together. But just to remind you how fabulous he is, he's a professor and director of research at the Law School of QUT. He is interested in the critiques of science and their implications for law and governance. He's currently working on projects relating to the limits of environmental law from the perspective of responding to damage, degradation, and restoration of ecosystems. And he's published widely in journals and books, and his most recent work included an edited collection with Benjamin Richardson on ecological restoration and the law. Afshin leads the Ecological Justice Research Group at QUT Law School and is co-chair of the Research Committee of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law. So over to you, Afshin.
Thank you, Erin. I think from now on, I'm going to call myself a transdisciplinary feral philosopher, Glenn. It's the best title I've had exposure to. Can I say, Glenn, what a pleasure it is to follow you. Your work's always been creative, and it's really hard to present really after such a creative and groundbreaking and innovative piece. So thank you for being part of this project and for the paper you presented. I also just want to acknowledge some of the European colleagues who've joined us, and it's really nice to see Esther, Andy, Marie, and probably others that I don't know well. So thank you all for being here. It's really nice to have an audience like you. And probably my last chance also to thank in front of others, Michelle Lim and Katie Woolaston, who've been really fantastic co-conspirators in this project and in the work. I've really loved working with them, and it's been such a pleasure to conceive of this project and to see it come to fruition in the few days we've had together. So thank you to you both for the effort, and also others who've helped us during this workshop. Now, before I was thinking, how do I share my slides? So I'm just gonna, should have done this before, but I'm just going to share my screen and hope that I get the right thing across. So sorry, just bear with me for a sec. And I hope I've got the right thing. So can I just double check that you're seeing my screen?
Yes, that's looking really good.
Okay, but I can't see anyone else. So I'm just, I'm going to speak. So this paper has an extension, which is the nature of legal decision-making, relationality, and extinction in environmental law. And in some way, I think I preface this by saying I'm doing some background work to what I think Glenn has already done, which is to extend the thinking beyond where I think some of this work might go. And you'll see towards the end what I mean by this. Before I start, I want to chart out where this paper is going in terms of the main argument we make, which is that the evolution of environmental law in dealing with extinction is something that I think comes to a head, and I think this pushes environmental law to have to think harder about its ontologies and what it takes for granted. And I'll explain this to you in a second. So in dealing with extinction, environmental law has traditionally focused or started off focusing very narrowly on activities that threaten species. You know, international conventions like CITES, for instance, initially started by focusing on trade and using trade to limit exploitation, and then went further beyond that to go into listing species that were threatened and influencing things in that direction. Environmental law then moved to creating a variety of systems and structures for listing species that are endangered. So you have CITES, IUCN red lists, and nationally, most countries now have lists of various kinds, including Australia, which are threatened species lists. And we've heard a little bit about that during this workshop. The next evolution in this process of environmental law dealing with extinction, I think, has come from this focus on managing and trying to deal with the broader drivers of biodiversity loss and habitat and ecosystems more broadly, rather than just simply focusing on species and threatened species. So how we control and regulate land use, for instance, is an example of how we try and manage the broader drivers of extinction and loss. So we then have this kind of next shift in this process of managing these broader drivers, where the social, cultural, and ecological forces that drive loss we find ourselves in a situation where they're not deeply coupled. We're unable to really resolve the tensions that arise when we move into this next phase of environmental laws development in terms of managing the broad drivers. And this comes out really prominently when decisions are being made around, say, the case that Katie and I spoke to in the first day of this symposium, where government and administrative and legal decision makers have to base decisions around criteria, and then they have to apply those criteria to particular scenarios and make assessments of whether or not something should happen or should not happen. Now, in that process of decision making, this coupling of cultural, social, and ecological systems falls apart, because somewhere along that process, decisions have to be made about one priority over another priority. And it's here that I think I make the point that environmental laws evolution is hitting this really difficult stage in its development, where the law still is grappling with the kind of instrumentalization of species, because it separates them from the system and separates them from what our needs are. And in that process, we create tensions within environmental law to deal with extinction. So sustainability, for instance, as a principle gets absorbed within the law, but it's weak and market-oriented, and it's not really properly coupling ecological, cultural, social norms and values into a system of law. And so the question I guess I pose in this paper, and I want to explore and ask you to think it through with me a bit, is whether there's a shift happening, and whether it's a shift that needs to continue to strengthen away from abstracting and fragmenting ecosystems and habitats. So this shift away from drivers and a focus on this abstract notion of the ecosystem, the wetland or the habitat, to creating and encouraging us to participate in things like cooperative, interactive, experiential, co-creation and transformative ways in which the law can move us. So the shift in environmental law needs to go beyond simple coupled perspectives, perhaps to other things. Now, I'll explore this a bit more, because I think there are concepts like adaptive and reflexive government approaches that are coming into play within environmental law. But unfortunately, because the system as a whole is built on instrumentalization and this kind of dualist notion of separating ourselves from the experience of nature and nature itself, we fail to properly couple nature versus human constructs. And so in that process, we fail to make effective, good decisions. So the shift that I'm suggesting, I think we probably need to somehow embed into environmental law, and I'll come to this, is the shift from ethical dispositions that are instrumental and intrinsic to what I want to explore as the relational shift. And so I'm going to spend the next few slides, and because of the diverse audience that we have, I've just put a few slides here, and I'll be circulating around the idea of what is relationality as an ethical shift to instrumentalist and an intrinsic environmental law that I want to, I guess, work with. So this is a simple rhizome. It's a bamboo rhizome. And the reason I put this picture up is I think it makes a really interesting point, which is the world is complex and not linear. And rhizomes have no particular direction through which change happens. You might get a little shoot that then becomes a structure, and it moves forward, onwards, sideways, and in many different directions. I take this concept of the rhizome from Guattari and Deleuze to really emphasize the point that change within complex systems is not linear, it's not rational, it's not something we can unpack. And I'll come to why I have this a little bit later. So the next few slides are all about different ways of showing you images and pictures to try and think through this idea of relationality. This next one is just simply a picture of an atom with protons, electrons, neutrons, and I wanted to explore what relationality is, because quantum physics made the point that what is actually real are not the protons, electrons, and neutrons, but the force that actually brings them together. So the force itself is what is real, but not the protons, electrons, and neutrons. And there are various ways in which different traditions have conceptualized this force to mystical Oriental thought that actually sees this force as quintessentially being about love, and so that the essential components of the universe, of what is real in life, is the love that connects protons, electrons, and neutrons. I'm being esoteric to make the point that relationality between these elements is what is real, and not necessarily the protons, electrons, and neutrons. But I move on to this point, which is complexity, because for me, where relationality becomes really important is in the context of complexity. And I'll explain in a little bit why. But one of the important things about complexity work is that a lot of traditional instrumentalist and even intrinsic approaches to ethics, and a lot of science in its traditional form that environmental law adopts, sees the world as one big machine that performs deterministically or with a degree of certainty. In other words, the objective and purpose of science is to ascertain what the patterns are, and presumes that they move in a deterministic process. Now, in that sense, then, complexity is something that we can understand and we unpack, and with humans in the middle of this complex world of culture and ecology and society, we can try and unpack it and determine then who has priority and who should and who shouldn't, and make decisions accordingly. Now, I draw really heavily in this work from Alfred North Whitehead as a process-oriented philosopher, and I distinguish some of the work we're doing here from other relational thinking by drawing on Whitehead, whose work is probably a bit more radical in terms of its relationality than others who do work in this space. But one of the things that Alfred Northhead does is he talks about the world as an everything in the world being in terms of, there's a sense of pervasive flux. Energy and information is constantly moving and shifting. And the moment it constructs an entity, the entity then creatively energizes itself through the relationships that it has and becomes something new. And I guess Northhead and Heidegger would go along with each other by saying that the world is always in the process of becoming rather than being. There's no essence, but something is always being made and created. And I wanted to put this picture of complexity up here to talk about how the world is constantly in a state of flux rather than actually being deterministic. And this is drawing from the critique of science that Alfred Northhead worked with, which is that science had to move away from Newtonian ideology.
Afshin, I'm just going to interrupt to say that's 11 minutes. So we've got 4.
Already, gosh, all right. So I've just got an image here of I love bonsais and I love the river red gum, and this is a bonsai, but Northhead talks about the world, a plant as a democracy of feelings, because he takes the plant, breaks it down to the entities that are constantly in a relation with one another, and talks about these entities as creating a democracy within the plant, whereas animals and other entities with a mental functioning system are have a centralized processing system, but in that process also they're constructing and bringing together the various entities that exist. So I'm just moving really quickly through this because I have quite a lot more. So the important, and I hope you'll forgive me for rushing through some of these because I had probably underestimated how much I had here. The main thing about the relational work of Whitehead and others is to understand the world, we have to experience it, because embodied engagement and responsiveness between all things in holistic situations is what we understand as being real. In other words, the mental processes of making up concepts and ideas is goes back to the dualist mode, which we have to try and avoid and ignore. So embodied engagement is the experience that makes the difference. Going through a couple of other points, nature then in this process is actually an event, and we're in a constant self-creative process, and Whitehead uses the word pervasive flux. So experiences and feelings then are cast out of nature by traditional dualisms to limit this idea, or to limit the world purely to sense perception and conceptualization of it. So Whitehead says the red glow of the sunset should be as much part of nature as the molecules and electric waves by which men of science would explain the phenomena. And so Whitehead tries to bring in many other dimensions of life to create a complete cosmology. In other words, the aesthetics and the morality of the world and science are all central to the experiences that we have with the world and what makes relationships and relational ideology work. I'm just going to skip this. So taking on the ethics aspect here, then I just simply draw on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where they particularly draw on the work of Kant in describing ecosystem services. And in this passage from Kant, Kant basically says the world is either instrumentally valuable or intrinsic. Intrinsic things have dignity, and instrumental is simply for the purposes of making those with dignity have something to work with. And so in this process, ethical values we have within law and systems also draw on this notion of instrumentalism or intrinsic worth. And in that process, though, I argue we also continue to bifurcate the world. So here, in the next couple of slides, I just want to focus on how relational thinking does things differently. So we talked a little bit over this workshop in relation to intrinsic thinking, but Whitehead's ethics or relational ethics goes beyond intrinsicness a little bit to talk about the property or qualities as being expressions of actual internal relations. In other words, we can still have intrinsic value, but for relational thinking, relations are first, and the self-organization or the ability of the system to organize itself through those relationships is what comes first. So drawing from Fair in 1996, the actualization, each actualization of the entities within a creation realizes beauty and deserves some kind of respect and attention. In other words, the relationships are prior and everything else comes after. And in that process, you can still have intrinsic value, but the relational aspects of it are central. Instrumental processes also are important, but from a Whitehead process-oriented perspective, there is no such thing that is purely a means to an end. In other words, a person or a subject is actually always embedded in a flow of constitutive relationships, which means that the process, that the point at which something becomes a means, the means changes the individual, becomes part of the relationship that makes the difference. So when someone gives you a cup as a present, the cup is more than matter. The cup becomes something meaningful because it connects you, the history of where that cup came from, and how you use the cup and how it becomes part of your life. The relational aspects in that process are central to making means more than just an instrument. And so for Whitehead, there is no such thing as pure instrumentalism as such. Sorry that I'm going through these quickly, but so relational values then, the radical version of it is always ontologically before everything else. The air we breathe is part, the air itself doesn't exist necessarily as an entity, but it has value because it becomes part of the relational aspect of the life that we have. So in that process, air takes on a different value system for us. And so I guess the point I make here is we tend to separate relations and bifurcate. So even when we talk about ecosystem services and supporting services, for instance, photosynthesis is listed as one of the supporting services. But how can we really separate an ecosystem from the primary role that chlorophyll plays in the production process itself? So trying to separate photosynthesis as a supporting service becomes rather meaningless. The second point about relational values is the creative and inherent agency in all living things is due to them being radically relational. Species are relational, they're patterns that embody specific forms of organization. In some way, indigenous communities have always had this deep, radical relational ontology between ecological, cultural, and social independence. And Whitehead, I guess, modernizes for himself through the history and philosophy of science a different version of what this means. So the question, I guess, that I want to pose here is what does radical relationalism do when it shifts our ethical dispositions beyond instrumentalism and intrinsic value, or reconceptualizes them and pushes us forward? And the pragmatic impacts of this are things, I guess, I've been giving some thought to for a while, and there's a body of literature that I'm trying to accumulate in terms of what it means practically to do relational work, and others perhaps will point me to it. But there has been some work recently by Ivana, a colleague at McGill, and Kirsten Anker, who tried to reconceptualize the rights of nature in terms of relational values that it might have. And I'm still not fully on top of this body of work, but I wanted to put it on the table as something that's really worthwhile thinking about, because the argument, I guess, and perhaps Glenn, this, where you were going as well, is that the rights discourse continues to build individuals and bifurcate. And Kirsten and Ivan try to shift the rights of nature discourse beyond that. Some of the work I've been doing myself in terms of restoration is not restoration as a pragmatic outcome of doing recovery work, but restoration as central to the development of a relational value system that environmental law can adapt to give people experiences, and experiences become the pragmatic foundations of a new ontology. And so restoration and the process of regeneration and rebuilding the environment and making decisions about how to actually do that, and whether to resort to historical baselines or to rebuild new systems that will deliver outcomes. That process of experiencing regeneration itself is part of the new relational value system that perhaps we can think about. The last slide here that I just want to put up is in terms of the potential of relationality, relational values, and environmental ethics that's built on relationality to have a transformative effect. And Isabella Stengers herself makes this point in relation to relationality back in 2010. And Glenn, I think the work you've been doing with rethinking concepts and language, and Judith Butler in '88 wrote about how concepts and language construct the world. And so here, I guess I put up the word that to really transform concepts and languages in law can make and rebuild the world. And so we need to think through, in terms of extinction, how that can be facilitated. So for instance, the use of the word endangered and endangered lists often is probably more political than actually transformative. And so instead of classifying and categorizing, Barnes in 2010, for instance, said, well, let's ignore that and let's remain open to indeterminacy and what he called conceptual ontic vagueness as a way to allow people to have experiences through the law to make sense of the world for themselves rather than to actually be classified and categorized and determined by it. And I put up Glenn's own concept of solastalgia because it's slowly starting to have traction within legal circles, and I think can make a big difference in terms of explaining distress. The second point just wanted to make here is in terms of the practices of care and how the practices of care bring out the relational ontology and the value system that comes with it. And the practices of care are not just an emotional sentiment in the human mind, but the practices of care are embodied, they're collective, and they're reciprocal practices that involve humans and non-humans. And here I draw from Bella Chase's work in 2015, and also an article that Esther pointed me to by West, which also makes a similar point about relational ontologies put for practices of care. Now, the reason I put this up here as potentially transforming the way environmental law does its work is that if legal decision makers were to embody the decisions and embody an experience that would enable their decisions to make, would that possibly and potentially enhance and create a better culture and practice of care through environmental law? The point I make is often decision makers in environmental law outsource consultancy reports, impact assessments, and so forth, and then decision makers make unengaged decisions that don't allow them to experience the particular environment, and in that process don't allow themselves to engage in that kind of relational turn that perhaps we need more of. And I just had a couple of pictures here to try and explain the relational turn, but I might stop at that and I guess open it up for a conversation about the relational turn in environmental law, and conclude here, I guess, with the first slide that I put up, which is environmental law clearly has reached certain limits because it relies on ethics that is purely instrumental and intrinsic, but in a way that separates humans from an experience of nature. In that process, then we need to shift and move away to a more relational turn. And whether that will do something different for extinction and how we achieve that and what transformative changes we see are things that I guess this paper wants to push for and explore. Thank you, and sorry for that. That was really rushed, but
thank you. Thank you, Afshin. That was another kind of wonderful way to really bring a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about over the past 2 days together. So thank you very much. I'm going to use the chair's privilege here and just relate a short example, I think, that really underscores your final point there about decision makers needing to embody the experience of the thing that they're making decisions about, and the way that environmental law can start to change to bring that into effect. The work we're doing as the Birrarung Council, so we are constituted under statute as the voice of the Birrarung, the Yarra River, and we've been bringing in the CEOs of local governments and various other responsible public entities along the river. And they come in and they tell us about what they've been doing, but before they get to that point, before they get to tell us anything about themselves, the chair of the Birrarung Council speaks to them, and this is a person who has been in water management for many years. He's not seen as being particularly radical or out there, but everybody has to sit there and hear him talk about what it means to be the voice of the river and what it means for the river to have a voice in these conversations. So we're trying to make that connection a little bit more real for people and to start linking the way that decision makers are thinking to and relating to the river in a much more direct way. So that's a really wonderful way of helping me frame the work that we're trying to do in that context. Now, we've got already some great questions. Esther, you've put some fantastic comments into the chat there, so I might just get you to maybe speak to those.
Okay, yes, thank you. So I wrote a little bit in the chat on the idea of relationality, because I felt it was important to put out there that there is this concept of relational values that is increasingly gaining traction. in the ecosystem services and social ecological systems literature, which influences a lot of the thinking that is going on, for example, in IPBES, but also in the sustainability science community. I took a very long time to figure this out because I had these really awkward discussions with key figures in those domains to make sense of what they understood as relational values, because in the first instance I was quite pleased to see that relational thinking was actually taking hold here, until I understood that what is happening here is exactly the opposite. So this notion of relational values is very poorly conceptualized generally, which is also typical of these communities, I must say. But what they've done actually is they assume they take relations as a separate ontological category. So very much in contrast with the whole idea of relational ontology and all of the thinking, the Lowe's, of course also Dewey, Rorty, Whitehead, etc., that underpins a lot, or from actor network theory, Annemarie Mol particularly, that underlies this notion of relationality. In contrast to all that thinking, what they're doing is create a separate category of values, relational values, next to actually intrinsic values and instrumental values. Now, for some, this is still seen as a step forward, and I think I'm still, I haven't made up my mind fully about this. But the lack of reflection is, or even awareness of what it is that they're doing epistemologically as well as ontologically has really been striking to me. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I think Esther, it's a really fascinating point, and I think I in my work trying to pull this stuff together, I came across a whole body of literature that does talk about relational values that I found disturbing in the same way, because I think what they try and do is develop this kind of Kantian notion of ethics that I think, I guess I was trying to move away from. Like and I think the trouble is there are scholars who do work in relational values and draw on Whitehead and still move on to build a value system base that is abstracting humans away from the system, from nature. I think that's why I wanted to use the word a radical relationality to focus on the significance of the ontological shift, which is that everything relationality comes before existence. But as you say, I think there's a danger that this is now turning into yet another modernist project.
It is very much, and
creating another set of values,
because I think in the end of it all, ontological pluralism is just impalatable for particularly for scientists working on the global level. And there are really strong ideological reasons for that, not just that they can't wrap their brain around that. This is ideological as well, because for global governance to continue to exist, there must be global science, and global science can only talk with authority about if there's one world. So I think that those lock-ins are really very deep.
Yeah, I think those are really fantastic points, Esther, and I'm really glad you say that, because I was getting disturbed by what I was, I guess, coming across and reading, and I kept going back in my work to Whitehead himself because I found more solace and comfort, and then I left Whitehead thinking this guy's just so hard to fathom. But I should also trace that where I come from, having spent years reading Michel Serres, a French philosopher who characterized what is real in the world as energy and information. But because I had no idea what to do with his work, I went to Whitehead and I found that as problematic. But which is why I think towards the end of these slides, I was trying to be pragmatic but not I guess,
No,
abstract
exactly.
away. Yeah. So thank you, Esther. I really appreciate those comments and thoughts.
Yeah,
And
I want to keep an open mind. I don't know. Perhaps it's a step forward for a body like IPBES, for example. Perhaps this is the best they can do. To talk about relations as, yeah, well, I don't know. And I'm glad you mentioned Ceres, because I think the thinking in actor network theory and the thinking in what you could call American pragmatism is very much aligned. It's just historically, there's historically different roots into it. And Ceres was, of course, quite fundamental, as was Whitehead actually, to Latour's thinking and Annemarie Mol, etc.
yeah.
Anyway.
So I think one of the things we started, when we first started this workshop, one of the comments, I guess, that I also made about environmental law and extinction itself is that the law doesn't cope particularly well with incompleteness, indeterminism, elusiveness, and all those qualities that make relationality so important, which is why I think sometimes there's a paper written by Jay Ellis, a Canadian scholar, and I remember she said that she really struggled to get reviewers to accept a piece for publication, because the point she made in that piece is law sometimes just needs indeterminism and incompleteness or lack of answers in order to allow people to investigate and discover for themselves through experience what is the normalized way of being. And so I think those are the comments that I think are really hard to absorb in a system that is imbued with positivist ideals. I might stop here and let questions to come up.
So I know Marie's got a question.
Thank you. That was really a fantastic paper presentation. I really enjoyed it. But I would like to come back to the last of your slide in which you mentioned Puig de la Bella Casa, and I wonder if following a bit what she argues in matters of care, if embodiment is really the best place to start for this turn to relationality, because somehow embodiment, it always assumes, let's say, it keeps the correlation, the Kantian correlation between the subject and the object, between the two objects or subjects that relate. And I think Puig de la Bella Casa makes a very important intervention with the turn to speculation, where embodiment is not enough, let's say, to also appreciate and care for all the elements, objects and subjects, non-human entities that we cannot relate to through embodiment, thereby also including, let's say, all the elements that we have to care for that remain invisible, that remain basically outside any relational positionality. And I think this very much aligns somehow with the turn in object-oriented ontology and speculative realism, where they also go a bit, they question the relationality that starts from embodiment, from an embodied experience. And I think this is very important to also take into account future, I mean, thinking in deep time perspectives, let's say, thinking about all the elements we have to care for that go way beyond a Kantian correlation between mind and body, between subject and object, etc. I wonder how you fit that into your account of relationality.
Yeah, look, Marie, thank you for that. That's another really fabulous comment and intervention. Thank you, and I really appreciate that thought. Look, I guess the way I would, and I guess for the purposes of others who may not be averse with this kind of thinking, I guess what you're suggesting is that we have to, the world exists beyond what we are capable of embodying, And perhaps, you know, you might say there's the global nature of the system that we can't really embody and experience. And, you know, how do you then deal with things that you can't experience and embody? And I think there's a book that's influenced me a lot, and I don't know how to say this person's, the Dear Bias. It's a book called Nature as Event. And the best I can do at this stage is just go back to Whitehead's work. And there's an element to Whitehead's work where he does try and move beyond embodiment to something that is perhaps more than that. The trouble, and this is what the Dear does, is keeps asking the question, is Whitehead reverting back to Platonic and Aristotelian ideologies, and as a result, does the process-oriented philosophy then fail the moment you move away from embodiment? I don't have an answer to your question, Marie. It's something I haven't been able to address or think about. So I think you really put your finger on a point that I have I'd like to be able to have a clear answer to, but I'm still grappling with that. But it's definitely, I guess, something I have to explore and think through, which is also a question about how does the law move away from this kind of issue of experiential way of dealing with things to, you know, other values which are really critical and important to law, which is consistency and justice, which are all abstractions away from it. And so how do you reconcile these things? But I think your point is a deeper philosophical one that I don't have an answer to, and I think you've caught me out on that one. But thank you for doing it. I appreciate it. So I'm not sure if that was a complete answer to you, except to say I'll take the humble pill and figure out how to move beyond embodiment for some things. Esther, I think you make the point about whether this is Karen Barrad's work, and yeah, I don't know, but I suspect Barrad tries to do that, and Miyasu as well, yeah.
Anybody else
Those
like
are all
to ask a question?
comments. I guess we've been engaging with the kind of really deeper philosophical angles here, both, which has been fantastic. But I also want, I guess, I was also trying. Quite often I get the comment, what does this mean in pragmatic terms? And so I was trying to, I guess, also make the pragmatic contribution about the kind of new terminologies and new ways of enabling decision makers to be embodied. And where this has all started for us really was when Katie and I was trying to analyze a decision that our Australian government made to allow a mine to proceed when that mine would enable the extinction of 13 invertebrate species. And the question I asked myself was, during this process of this paper, was, would an embodied experience, or would a decision maker who could experience and embody what they were thinking about do something different, or would the process look different, and how would that look like? And I don't know if I came up with an answer, just it was more a question for me. Thank you again for the opportunity to talk to this. And
Well, I think unless there's another question from someone, I might move it into the conversation around next steps, which probably means handing back to Afshin and Michelle. I think Katie's going to keep her video off for the moment. So do you guys want to have a bit of a chat about where we go from here after these 2 great days?
Michelle, do you want to have a go, or do you? So I think there's a few of you here who are already with really well-developed papers that are going into the Griffith Law Review, which is a really interdisciplinary journal that publishes across law, culture, theory. But we're also putting together hopefully an edited book, which will go in with Routledge. And from that, our goal is to draw papers from the Griffith Law Review, but also we have asked a number of the presenters here all came on board because they were all going to also write papers that would go into an edited collection called Environmental Law's Extinction Problem. And now I can see the authors here who are putting in papers for the Griffith Law Review, but because it's Routledge, we can draw on those papers automatically for the edited collection. So our goal was to reprint them and add another group of papers to turn into an edited book on extinction, environmental extinction problem. That's where the project's going so far, and hopefully we will continue to build on the literature in this space, because one of the things, in my view, that the papers here have presented is that extinction definitely generates a range of questions that environmental law hasn't had to necessarily ask itself, and it pushes environmental law to critique and analyze itself much harder. And I don't know if that's the observation others who've been here have come up. It definitely pushes environmental law beyond its comfort zones. And so I think we want to explore that idea. And thank those of you who are doing papers for the GLR and hopefully the edited book. So I think that's the way. Michelle, do you want to say something to conclude this? Because you've played a big role in bringing all of this together, and I want to thank you for that too. And thank you to those of you who've been here with us the whole time for the 2 days. It's actually been really, really stimulating, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the papers, the conversations, the really meaningful questions that have come. And more importantly for me as a scholar who really values interdisciplinary, having groups of academics here from so many disciplines has meant this has been a really rich dialogue, and the feedback I've just had from you as well, reinforces that.
Thanks, Afshin. I really don't have much to say, but to thank you and Katie very much for focusing. And I think all of the speakers and everyone who has participated in this workshop as well, the fact that both of you have, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to really focus on that point of extinction, because it's different to other ways of thinking, the finality of it, the forcing us to think at this horrible endpoint. And I suppose this might be a point to confess that I've cried more writing my paper than any other, not because it's been awful working with you, but because being forced to deal with this increasingly difficult issue has been something that I've been grateful for the opportunity to engage with, and also perhaps drawing on Rob's comments last night, that it also gives us this avenue to think about what's environmental law's extinction solution, if we are going to be that arrogant to assume it does have a solution, or to think about other ways in where that solution might lie. So not much to say, but to say thank you for that opportunity to think in that sense. And as you're saying, in many different ways that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to think of as well, and all the contributions that we've had, it's been so nice. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle. All right. I guess we can finish up and say thank you to everyone, and see you across the Griffith Law Review, the other stuff. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Catherine, for helping us organize this. Not sure if you're still there. Thank you very much. Thank you to the various groups from Myanmar, Colombia, the US and other places as well. Wonderful to have this participation.